The skies over Burkina Faso have long been darkened, not by clouds, but by the shadow of violence and despair. For years, a nation of proud hands and fertile soil has been forced to fight with broken tools against enemies wielding the sharpest steel. Yet, in the midst of this imbalance, one decision has struck like a hammer against the anvil of history. Ibrahim Traoré has signed a defense pact with Pakistan. This is not paper. This is not ceremony. This is the seed of a future where Burkina Faso may no longer bow its head to terror. Fighter jets, tanks, drones. These are not just machines of war. They are shields of dignity. But the question resounds, why Pakistan and why now? What vision lies behind this unprecedented partnership? And can it truly shift the destiny of a landlocked nation in the heart of Africa? Stay with us. This moment may reshape Africa's defense future. Subscribe and witness the story. Burkina Faso is a land of paradox. Beneath its sun-scorched soil lies a people of resilience. Yet for decades, their resilience has been tested by an endless storm of insecurity. Insurgent groups tore through the countryside like locusts. Villages became ashes, and the streets of Ouagadougou carried more grief than song. At the heart of this crisis stood a fragile army, brave in spirit, yet shackled by outdated rifles and vehicles that belonged to another age. The imbalance was cruel. Enemies armed with modern weapons, while Burkina Faso's soldiers fought with relics. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into leadership, he inherited not only power, but a nation gasping for protection. His mandate was not written in ink, but carved in urgency: restore safety or watch the nation unravel. The question was immediate. How does a landlocked nation, burdened with poverty and surrounded by threats, find the means to defend its people? The answer did not come from Paris, nor from Washington, but from Islamabad. Pakistan, a country that had faced decades of insurgency, war, and survival, had walked a path Burkina Faso knew all too well. Traoré recognized a reflection. A nation that had built its defense industry not out of luxury, but necessity. Where others saw a risky partner, he saw a mirror of resilience. The centerpiece of this pact was an aircraft already carving its name into the annals of modern warfare, the JF-17 Thunder. To the untrained eye, it may appear as just another fighter jet, but to Burkina Faso, it represented wings of sovereignty. Unlike the Western-made F-16s or Rafales, which demanded billions, the JF-17 was forged with a different philosophy: affordable strength without compromise. This jet was more than a machine. It was a promise. Its radar systems, capable of tracing enemy aircraft from miles away, gave Burkina Faso's skies a pair of watchful eyes. Its beyond visual range missiles allowed it to strike before being seen, turning the hunter into the hunted. And its ability to slip through radar detection gave it the quality of a phantom, a guardian invisible to those who sought to destroy. In Traoré's vision, this was not just about air dominance. It was about dignity. For the first time, Burkina Faso's pilots could sit in cockpits that matched their courage with technology. For the first time, the skies over Ouagadougou and beyond could be defended not with desperation, but with confidence. The JF-17 was described in whispers as the bird of death by its adversaries. But for Burkina Faso, it was a bird of hope. Yet technology is only half the story. The partnership with Pakistan was not a mere transaction of steel and engines. It was a transfer of knowledge, training, and strategy. A chance for Burkina Faso's armed forces to learn from a nation seasoned in asymmetric warfare. Each aircraft was not only a weapon, but also a classroom where pilots and engineers could absorb lessons that no textbook could teach. Still, a fighter jet alone cannot guard the soil. While the JF-17 lifted eyes to the skies, the ground beneath Burkina Faso still trembled with insurgent footsteps. The nation's security could not be secured by wings alone. It needed iron hooves to thunder across deserts and forests alike. And so, the story of this pact did not end in the air. It descended to the battlefield, where steel met soil, and a different beast awaited its introduction. If the skies belonged to the JF-17, the earth demanded its own guardian. For Burkina Faso, that guardian came in the form of a roaring beast of steel, the Al-Khalid tank. This was no relic of a bygone era. It was a war horse forged for the modern battlefield, with a 120-millimeter gun that spat fire capable of reducing enemy armor to ruins in seconds. Its speed defied the stereotype of tanks as lumbering giants. On open plains, it galloped like a stallion. On sandy tracks, it glided with purpose, and through the rocky terrain, it carved paths as if the earth itself yielded. In Al-Khalid, Burkina Faso found not just a weapon, but a companion for its soldiers, one that shielded them with layered armor against rockets and missiles, one that could see and strike in rain, fog, or night. To a nation scarred by ambushes in villages and convoys, decimated in the bush, the tank was not a symbol of aggression, but of resilience. It was a fortress on tracks, a promise to citizens that the days of watching helplessly as insurgents overran their lands were coming to an end. Yet, in the new theater of war, battles are not only fought by men and machines on the ground, they are fought by unseen eyes circling overhead. That is why Traore's pact with Pakistan extended into the realm of drones, Burak, and Shapar, machines that married patience with precision. These drones were more than tools of surveillance. They were hunters in the sky, armed with laser-guided missiles that could eliminate a threat without risking the life of a single soldier. In a land where insurgent groups struck swiftly and vanished into the bush, drones promised a relentless pursuit. They could hover for hours, watching, waiting, until the exact moment to strike. For a military stretched thin across vast landscapes, these silent guardians multiplied their reach. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, Burkina Faso's enemies had dictated the terms of battle, striking where they pleased, retreating when they wished. With drones, that era was beginning to end. Insurgents, who once believed themselves invisible, now lived under an unblinking gaze. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was palpable. Young men who had grown weary of funerals now saw fighter jets soaring, tanks maneuvering, drones humming. Recruitment into the armed forces rose, fueled not only by patriotism, but by pride. Pride that their army was no longer a symbol of weakness, but of renewal. Mothers, who once whispered prayers every time their sons left home, now carried a flicker of reassurance. The nation's heart began to beat not in fear, but in anticipation. Abroad, the move did not pass unnoticed. In Western capitals, analysts scribbled reports. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation turning towards Pakistan for its defense needs. Some saw it as desperation. Others recognized a strategic shift, a statement that the nation was stepping outside its colonial shadow and writing a new chapter in sovereignty. Regional leaders, too, watched carefully. Would this inspire others to follow, to diversify their partnerships, to challenge the established order? It was here that the pact took on a meaning beyond weapons. It was no longer just a story of jets, tanks, and drones. It was about dignity, about a nation refusing to remain dependent on outdated hand-me-downs, about a leader willing to chart a course that defied expectations. The crescendo was unmistakable. A small African nation, long overlooked, now wielded tools of modern warfare. The people's spirits surged, their voices no longer whispers of despair, but chants of resilience. But with every rise comes a question. Can these machines of war deliver not just power, but lasting peace? Or will they open a new chapter of challenges yet unseen? The roar of engines and the flight of steel birds brought immediate pride to Burkina Faso. But every victory casts a longer shadow. What happens when the dust settles, when parades end, and when weapons must prove their worth beyond symbolism? In the short term, the effects were visible. Recruitment into the armed forces swelled, not merely out of duty, but out of inspiration. Young men and women saw strength where once there had been only vulnerability. The sight of jets soaring above Ouagadougou, the grinding tracks of tanks crossing dusty roads, the whisper of drones overhead, all these rekindled a sense of ownership in the nation's future. Morale, long buried under the rubble of repeated attacks, rose like a phoenix. Communities most affected by insurgency felt a wave of reassurance. Villages that had known only silence and fear now began to hope that state power would return. The pact with Pakistan became not only a military upgrade, but a psychological shield, a message that the government was no longer a passive observer, but an active defender. Yet the long-term picture was more complex. Modern armies are not built in a day. Each fighter jet requires maintenance. Each tank consumes resources, and each drone demands training and intelligence networks. For a country whose economy has long struggled, these obligations could strain the national budget. Some critics whispered that the pact risked tethering Burkina Faso to new dependencies, that sovereignty might trade one form of reliance for another. The political dimension was equally charged. Ibrahim Traoré rose to power through upheaval, an Ibrahim Traoré coup that marked a break with the old order. Supporters viewed this military pact as proof of his vision, a leader unwilling to bow to colonial chains, willing instead to forge unconventional alliances. To them, it was the embodiment of independence, trade over aid, partnership over pity. But opponents saw a gamble. They questioned whether heavy investment in weapons would divert resources from schools, hospitals, and the urgent needs of daily life. Could Burkina Faso afford to balance both? Or would the pursuit of security come at the cost of development? These were not idle questions. They struck at the heart of governance. Is power measured in the guns one holds, or in the dignity of one's people? There were also societal consequences. The surge of nationalism inspired by new weapons brought unity, but unity forged in the heat of conflict can also harden divisions. Militias, emboldened by arms, could misuse the spirit of mobilization. Civilian oversight of the military became ever more crucial, lest the instruments of sovereignty turn inward. And then came the insurgents' response. They adapted, as they always had. The arrival of jets and drones forced them to scatter, to burrow deeper into remote terrain, to alter their tactics. For every advantage technology granted, insurgents sought new ways to exploit weaknesses. The battlefield was not only of metal and fire, but of strategy and patience. Yet hope persisted. Citizens believed that with the right leadership, the pact could be a bridge from despair to stability, from constant defense to lasting security. It was not only about weapons, but about the message. Burkina Faso was no longer kneeling. It was standing, armed and unyielding. And so, the nation stood at a crossroads. On one side, lay the promise of sovereignty defended by modern arms. On the other, the risk of overextension, dependency, and unforeseen costs. The question lingers in the dust of the Sahel. Can these weapons of steel and fire be forged into a shield of peace? Or will they carve new wounds into a land already scarred? No nation acts in isolation, and no deal of such magnitude goes unnoticed. As the ink dried on the defense pact between Ouagadougou and Islamabad, eyes from across the globe turned to Burkina Faso. Within West Africa, the response was cautious. ECOWAS, already wary after waves of political upheavals in the Sahel, viewed the deal with both suspicion and curiosity. On one hand, it symbolized a nation taking ownership of its security rather than waiting for foreign troops to arrive under the banner of peacekeeping. On the other, it signaled a deeper militarization that could set precedents across the region. Leaders whispered, would this embolden others to look eastward, beyond traditional Western partners, for their security needs? The African Union struck a more diplomatic tone, recognizing the right of every sovereign state to defend itself. Yet behind formal statements lay a quiet tension. If one small landlocked nation could rearm through alternative partnerships, what might this mean for the balance of power across the continent? Pakistan, meanwhile, gained more than just an export deal. It won a foothold in Africa's security architecture, a chance to showcase its indigenous defense industry to governments facing similar challenges. The JF-17s and Al-Khalid tanks were not merely machines of war. They were ambassadors of a new kind of diplomacy, one based not on aid but on trade, not on charity but on capability. In Western capitals, the mood was far less celebratory. For decades, France had positioned itself as the security guarantor of the Sahel. The United States, too, maintained military cooperation and counterterrorism interests in the region. The sight of Burkina Faso forging ties with Pakistan was more than a procurement decision. It was a signal of defiance. Analysts framed it as a chapter in the broader Burkina Faso Revolution, a movement not of ideology, but of sovereignty, rejecting dependency on former colonial and Western powers. The media echoed this divide. Some outlets hailed Traore as pragmatic, arguing that his choices reflected the harsh reality of survival in a volatile region. Others painted the deal as risky, warning of a deeper drift away from Western influence that could reshape alliances across Africa. What is certain is that the pact carried weight beyond borders. It became a litmus test of whether Africa's smaller nations could break free from dependency, diversify partnerships, and still hold their ground in an unforgiving world order. Yet as the world watched, one question remained. Was this pact a foundation for lasting sovereignty, or merely the opening move in a game of shifting allegiances that could pull Burkina Faso into even greater storms? The pact with Pakistan was never meant as an end in itself. It was a beginning, a seed planted in the soil of Burkina Faso's struggle. But what grows from that seed depends on more than machines of steel and engines of fire. In the years ahead, the nation faces a delicate balance. The opportunities are real. With modern tools, Burkina Faso can finally push back against insurgents who have plagued its villages and towns. Young recruits, inspired by new capabilities, can form a professional army capable of more than survival. The pact could lay the groundwork for sovereignty, a sovereignty defended not by borrowed troops, but by the nation's own hands. Yet dangers lurk alongside hope. Modern warfare is costly. Maintaining fighter jets, tanks, and drones requires not only money, but infrastructure, training, and consistent supply chains. Should the economy falter, or should political winds shift, the very strength meant to secure Burkina Faso could weigh heavily as a burden. The question of dependency hovers like a shadow. Can the nation sustain its arsenal without yielding too much to external partners? Then there is the human element. Weapons may deter enemies, but lasting peace demands more than firepower. Development, reconciliation, and justice must march alongside military strength. If these remain neglected, the roar of engines may drown out the cries of insurgents, but not the roots of unrest that gave them power. Still, there is a chance that this pact becomes more than defense. It could spark investment in local industries, technical training, and regional cooperation. It could transform Burkina Faso into a beacon for neighbors who seek to rise without chains, to stand with dignity, to trade partnership for dependence. In the heart of the Sahel, a story is being written in sweat, steel, and soil. Ibrahim Traoré has chosen a path few expected, one that could either lift his nation into sovereignty or entangle it in new storms. And as Burkina Faso marches forward, the question remains, will the harvest of this seed be one of freedom or of fire? Burkina Faso's story is no longer one of silence. For too long, its people fought with weapons too old, against enemies too ruthless, in a struggle that seemed endless. That injustice fueled anger, a righteous fury at being forced to face modern terror with outdated tools. It was a wound carved deep into the nation's pride. There is regret, too, in remembering how many lives were lost while waiting for promises of support that never came. Villages abandoned, children displaced, mothers mourning. These are scars not easily erased. They remind us that sovereignty delayed is sovereignty denied. But today, a different note resounds. Hope flickers in the roar of engines, in the steel tracks of tanks, in the unblinking gaze of drones above the Sahel. This pact with Pakistan has given Burkina Faso more than weapons. It has given back a sense of dignity. Where once despair reigned, there is now resolve. It is in this light that the Ibrahim Traoré coup must be remembered, not merely as a seizure of power, but as a turning point in a nation's destiny. Twice over, his leadership now stands defined by choices that defied expectations. First in seizing the reins of power, and then in seeking partners outside the colonial orbit. For many, this is more than politics. It is survival. It is pride. It is sovereignty in action. And so, the pact is woven into the larger tapestry of the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolution not of slogans, but of sovereignty. Not of ideology, but of independence. If one small landlocked nation can reclaim its dignity through courage and unconventional alliances, what stops the rest of Africa from doing the same? The road ahead is uncertain, but the direction is clear. The soil has been planted with seeds of resilience. What harvest will come, whether of peace or of fire, depends on the hands that nurture it, and the unity of a people who refuse to bow. If this story speaks to your sense of justice, do not walk away. Subscribe, share, and stand with us, for this journey is far from over.